A vast continent stirs in the half-light of a new century. In the villages of northern China, in the crowded streets of Shanghai, and across the rising empire of Japan, the forces that will reshape the world are already in motion. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. This is episode 4 of our long-form journey through the origins of the Second World War, and tonight we turn eastward to a region where tension, ambition, and revolution were rewriting the future long before the rest of the world realized it. In our last episode, we lingered in Western Europe, watching Mussolini and Hitler climb from the political margins to the center of power. Now, as you settle in and let the day fall away, we'll follow a different path toward conflict, one shaped by China's years of humiliation and upheaval, the rise of nationalists and communists, the Long March, the dramatic kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek in the Xi'an incident, and the clashes with Japan that would eventually ignite into full-scale war after the Marco Polo Bridge. I've spent many hours researching and shaping this narrative so it can guide you gently towards sleep, while still giving you a clear, steady understanding of how East Asia moved from civil strife to open conflict on the eve of World War II. If this calm style of storytelling helps you rest, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time of night you've joined us. It's always meaningful to see this quiet community gathering from around the world. Take a slow breath and let's begin. The mountains of Shenxi lay silent beneath a hard winter sky. Dawn had only just begun to thin the darkness, and the cold was the kind that seemed to settle into the bones of the earth itself. Snow clung to every ridge and hollow, softening the jagged stones yet doing nothing to ease the bitter wind that swept down from the high passes. In a shallow cave carved into the hillside, a lone figure crouched against the cold, his thin robe fluttering like a torn banner in the gusts that rolled through the rocks. His breath came in uneven clouds, his hands and feet were raw and bleeding, and though the morning was still young, he had already been awake for hours, shaken not only by exhaustion, but by a fury that burned hotter than the icy air around him. He had fled in such haste that even his dentures had been left behind on a bedside table, a small detail that now made the cold bite deeper, for every breath stung his bare gums. Yet the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt rising inside him, a humiliation that trembled through his voice when he finally stood, turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps, and shouted into the open air that they should shoot him and be done with it. The words echoed across the snow, sharp and startling, as if the mountains themselves were taken aback by the outburst, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch for a long moment before the soldiers appeared at the mouth of the cave. They did not raise their rifles. Instead, their commander stepped forward, saluted with deliberate calm, and then knelt in the snow as though presenting himself before a sovereign rather than a fugitive. He told the shivering man that they had not come to kill him, that they were there to protect him, and that all they asked was that he lead them, not against his own countrymen, but against the Japanese forces pressing ever deeper into China. The words hung in the cold air like a fragile offering, and for a moment the wind itself seemed to pause, as if waiting to see how the Generalissimo would respond. Hours earlier, Chiang Kai-shek had been running from these very men. Now he was their captive, and the strange reversal of roles settled over the mountainside like a second snowfall. The commander, seeing the Generalissimo's injuries and the steep descent ahead, offered to carry him on his back down the treacherous slope. It was an image almost too surreal to believe, the leader of all nationalist China, borne through the snow by the subordinate who had defied him. Yet it was in this unlikely posture that the next chapter of China's fate began to take shape. For in this frozen corner of Shenxi province, amid the rocks and the wind and the bitter cold, a decision was forming that would push China and Japan toward open war. Chiang had come to Shenxi in the winter of 1936 to confront Marshal Chiang Shui-ling, the young commander of the region's forces and a man who had once been counted among his most loyal subordinates. As head of the Kuomintang, Chiang had long believed that China's survival depended on crushing the communists who opposed his rule, unifying the nation under a single banner before turning to face the growing threat from Japan. But Marshal Chiang, like many others, had begun to question the wisdom of fighting Chinese while foreign troops carved deeper into the country's northern territories. He believed that the internal conflict must be set aside, that the communists and nationalists must stand together if China hoped to resist the Japanese advance. When Chiang arrived in Shan, he refused to entertain such arguments. He insisted that a soldier's duty was obedience, not debate, and he ordered Chiang to resume the campaign against the communists entrenched in the region. The marshal, frustrated and increasingly convinced that Chiang's priorities endangered the nation, made a choice that would shock the world. He and his closest allies devised a plan to seize their own commander, to force him into a position where he would have no choice but to reconsider his course. They called it an attempt to stimulate his awakening, a phrase that would later appear in official statements, though the reality was far more dramatic than the words suggested. Before dawn, Chiang's Manchurian troops, fur-hatted and disciplined, stormed the Generalissimo's quarters at a hotel outside Shan. They captured his staff with swift precision, but Chiang himself managed a desperate escape, climbing over a 10-foot wall, falling into a moat that wrenched his back, and scrambling barefoot into the mountains. It was a flight born of instinct and pride, and it carried him only as far as the cave where the soldiers finally found him, trembling with cold and fury. By the next morning, the world knew what had happened. Marshal Chiang broadcast the news that he was holding Chiang Kai-shek hostage until the Generalissimo agreed to halt the civil war and lead a united front against Japan. The announcement struck like lightning across China and beyond. Madame Chiang would later say that the news arrived like a thunderclap from a clear sky, and for many, it truly felt as though the ground beneath Chinese politics had shifted overnight. What followed inside Xi'an remains partly obscured by time and conflicting accounts. At first, Qian demanded unconditional release or immediate execution, refusing to negotiate from a position he considered dishonorable. But as the days passed, intermediaries arrived, trusted advisors, seasoned envoys, and eventually representatives of the Communist Party, including Zhou Enlai. They argued that killing Chiang would plunge China into endless civil war, destroying any hope of resisting Japan. Their reasoning carried weight, and though the conversations were tense, they slowly began to reshape the atmosphere inside the city. Then came Madame Chiang Kai-shek, whose presence alone altered the emotional landscape. She spoke with firmness and grace, appealing to the marshal's patriotism and to her husband's sense of responsibility. Her influence, combined with the mounting pressure from all sides, helped guide the negotiations toward a fragile agreement. On Christmas Day, Chiang Kai-shek boarded a plane back to Nanking with his wife, his advisors, and one unexpected passenger, Marshal Chiang himself. The marshal insisted on facing charges of mutiny, and though he was court-martialed and convicted, he was soon pardoned and placed under what was effectively lifelong house arrest. And so the Xi'an incident came to an end, leaving behind a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and the faint but growing sense that China's internal divisions might at last give way to a united stand against the storm gathering in the east. The events that unfolded in the mountains were not born in a single night. They had been gathering for months, perhaps even years, like a slow-moving storm that no one wished to acknowledge. Marshal Chang Shui-liang, the young commander of the northeastern armies, had once stood firmly at Chiang Kai-shek's side. He had inherited both his position and a complicated legacy after the Japanese seized Manchuria, and the loss had carved something deep into him, a wound that never fully closed. It shaped his loyalties, his fears, and eventually his defiance. And as 1936 drew toward its bitter end, that wound began to guide his decisions more than any order from Nanking. Chang watched the Japanese advance with a kind of haunted clarity. He saw their foothold in Manchuria harden into occupation, saw their intentions stretch farther south, and felt the weight of every village and province that might fall next. To him, the danger was unmistakable, yet the generalissimo remained fixed on the internal struggle, determined to crush the communists before turning to face the foreign threat. It was a strategy rooted in his belief that China must be unified under a single authority before it could hope to resist an external enemy. But to Chang, and to many others, the logic felt increasingly hollow. The Japanese were not waiting for China to settle its quarrels. They were advancing while Chinese soldiers fought Chinese soldiers, and the contradiction gnawed at him. When Chang arrived in Shan to demand obedience, the meeting between the two men was tense from the start. The generalissimo dismissed the marshal's objections with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, insisting that duty required action against the communists entrenched in the region. Chang, who had already been in quiet contact with those same communists, felt the last threads of patience fray. He believed that continuing the civil war would only weaken China further, leaving it exposed to the very enemy who had already taken his homeland. And so, in the days that followed, he and his closest advisors began to consider a path that no loyal subordinate should ever contemplate. The plan they devised was bold, dangerous, and almost unthinkable. They would seize the generalissimo himself, not to overthrow him, but to force him to reconsider the course he had set for the nation. They hoped that by confronting him with the consequences of his decisions, by placing him in a position where he could no longer ignore the urgency of the Japanese threat, they might awaken in him a new resolve. It was a gamble that could easily have ended in bloodshed, yet they convinced themselves that the risk was necessary. China, they believed, could not survive another year of internal conflict while foreign armies pressed at its borders. The operation began before dawn. Chang's Manchurian troops, wrapped in heavy fur hats against the cold, moved with quiet precision through the corridors of the Generalissimo's hotel. They captured his staff quickly, but Chang himself slipped away in the confusion, climbing over a wall and vanishing into the darkness. His escape forced the marshal's men into the mountains, where they eventually found him in the cave that would become the setting for one of the most dramatic confrontations in modern Chinese history. By morning, the world knew what had happened. Chang broadcast a message declaring that he was holding his commander until certain conditions were met, the most important being an end to the civil war and the formation of a united front against Japan. The announcement stunned observers both inside and outside China. It was as if the political landscape had shifted overnight, revealing fault lines that had been hidden beneath years of tension and compromise. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some saw Chang as a traitor, others viewed him as a patriot acting in desperation. But whatever judgment history would eventually render, the fact remained that he had taken an extraordinary step, one that forced the nation to confront the question it had been avoiding. Could China afford to fight itself while a foreign power carved deeper into its territory? Inside Xi'an, the atmosphere grew heavy with uncertainty. Chiang refused to yield at first. demanding either unconditional release or death. His pride, his authority, and his vision for China all collided with the reality of his captivity. Yet, as the days passed, the situation evolved. Negotiators arrived, advisors whispered counsel, and the marshal, who had taken such a daring step, now found himself navigating a delicate balance between firmness and restraint. The world watched, unsure whether the crisis would end in reconciliation or catastrophe, and in the quiet rooms where the discussions unfolded, the future of China hung in the balance, suspended between the ambitions of one leader, the fears of another, and the shadow of an empire rising in the east. In the days that followed the dramatic capture in the mountains, Shen settled into a strange stillness. The city was tense, yet outwardly calm, as though holding its breath while events inside its walls unfolded behind closed doors. Chiang Kai-shek, still stiff from his fall and the cold of the mountains, refused at first to acknowledge the situation he had been forced into. He demanded release without conditions. He insisted that his captors either free him immediately or carry out the execution he believed they intended. His voice, even in captivity, carried the same imperious certainty that had guided him through years of war and political struggle, and for a time it seemed as though no argument could move him from that rigid stance. But the crisis did not remain contained within Xi'an for long. Word of the kidnapping traveled quickly, and soon the city began to fill with figures who had been summoned or who came of their own accord to prevent the situation from spiraling into disaster. Among the first was William H. Donald, the Australian journalist turned advisor who had once served Marshal Chang and later became a trusted confidant of the Generalissimo. He arrived with the weary calm of a man accustomed to navigating political storms, and he carried with him a rare advantage. Both sides believed he would speak honestly. His presence softened the edges of the confrontation, though it did not resolve it. As the talks stretched on, another delegation approached Xi'an, one whose arrival would shift the tone of the negotiations entirely. Leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, traveling under the authority of political commissar Zhou Enlai, made their way into the city. Zhou entered the discussions with a quiet composure that contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. He argued that killing Chong would plunge China into a civil war without end, a conflict so consuming that no united resistance against Japan could ever be formed. His reasoning was clear, and though he spoke with restraint, the urgency beneath his words was unmistakable. Behind his arguments lay the unmistakable pressure of Moscow, for Stalin viewed Japan as a threat to the Soviet Union's eastern flank and had no desire to see China collapse into chaos. The negotiations moved slowly, like a river pushing through winter ice. Chang remained defiant. Chang remained determined, and the intermediaries moved between them, carrying messages, appeals, and warnings. Yet even with all these voices in the room, the atmosphere remained brittle, as though one wrong word might shatter the fragile balance holding the crisis in place. Then, at last, another figure arrived, one whose presence altered the emotional landscape more profoundly than any argument or political calculation. Madame Chiang Kai-shek entered Xi'an with a calm that belied the gravity of the moment. She was elegant, resolute, and unafraid to confront the marshal directly. Her conversations with him were firm but not hostile, shaped by a deep understanding of both her husband's temperament and the marshal's conflicted loyalties. She spoke to him not only as the wife of the man he had seized, but as a fellow patriot who understood the weight of the choices before them. Her influence extended beyond the marshal. She also spoke with her husband, urging him to consider the broader consequences of his refusal. Her presence softened him in ways that political advisors could not, And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere inside Xi'an began to shift. The arguments that had once seemed immovable began to bend. The possibility of compromise, once unthinkable, took shape like a distant outline emerging through fog. By Christmas Day, the crisis had reached its resolution. Chiang Kai-shek boarded a plane bound for Nanking, accompanied by his wife, his advisors, and, in a gesture that astonished many, Marshal Chiang himself. The marshal insisted on facing the consequences of his actions. He submitted to a court-martial, accepted his conviction, and received a sentence that was quickly followed by a pardon. Yet the pardon did not restore his freedom. Instead, he entered a long period of confinement that would shadow the rest of his life, a quiet punishment for a bold act that had reshaped the course of China's struggle. And so the Xi'an incident came to its close. The city exhaled, the negotiators dispersed, and the generalissimo returned to the capital with a new, uneasy understanding of the forces gathering around him. Forces that would soon pull China into a war far larger than any internal conflict it had ever known. For nearly 300 years, China had lived beneath the long, unbroken rule of the Manchu emperors. Their dynasty, once vigorous and confident, had grown old in the way great empires often do, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the weight of time itself began to press against the foundations. The Middle Kingdom still carried the grandeur of its ancient past, yet beneath the surface, the world was changing in ways the imperial court could no longer control, and as the 19th century unfolded, the country found itself exposed to forces that would reshape its destiny. Foreign powers arrived first as traders, then as creditors, and finally as occupiers of small but significant pieces of Chinese soil. Their presence was not subtle. In cities like Shanghai and Canton, entire districts were carved out and placed under foreign administration, creating pockets of land where Chinese law no longer applied. These concessions were reminders of treaties signed under duress, each one a quiet humiliation that settled into the national memory like sediment in a riverbed. They were places where Chinese citizens could walk the streets of their own cities and yet feel like strangers, governed by rules written in distant capitals. The defeats that followed only deepened the sense of national injury. In the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, China lost not only the vassal kingdom of Korea, but also territories that had long been part of its sphere of influence, including the island of Formosa, the land that would later be known as Taiwan. The loss was more than territorial, it was psychological, a stark reminder that the empire was no longer the unassailable power it had once been. And as the years passed, each new concession, each new treaty, each new foreign demand added another layer to the growing sense of vulnerability. These accumulated wounds did not go unnoticed by the younger generation. Across the provinces, a new kind of restlessness began to take shape, quiet at first, then louder, as students, thinkers and reformers questioned why their country had fallen so far behind the modern world. Among them was a young man named Sun Yat-sen, born into a peasant family in the south and educated as a physician. He carried within him a conviction that China could be reborn, that the old dynasty could be swept aside, and that the nation could reclaim its dignity if only it found the courage to change. Sun's ideas grew in the fertile soil of discontent. He spoke of ending the Manchu rule, of resisting foreign domination, and of building a republic that would reflect the will of the people rather than the decrees of a fading imperial court. His vision resonated with those who felt the weight of China's decline most acutely: the students who marched in protest, the workers who lived under foreign laws in their own cities, and the intellectuals who saw the world modernizing while their homeland remained trapped in the past. By the time World War I ended, Sun had succeeded in helping to topple the dynasty, but the republic that replaced it was fragile, more symbolic than real. Power fractured almost immediately. Warlords carved the country into territories they ruled like medieval barons, each with his own army, his own ambitions, and his own interpretation of what China's future should be. The dream of unity remained distant, shimmering like a mirage on the horizon. Then came 1919, a year that would ignite a new wave of awakening. When the Treaty of Versailles handed Germany's former holdings in Shandong province, not back to China but to Japan, outrage swept through the nation. Students in Peking took to the streets, their protests spreading from city to city until it culminated in a massive strike in Shanghai. The movement that emerged, later known as the May 4th movement, was more than a protest. It was a declaration that China would no longer accept humiliation as its fate, and from its energy arose the two great forces that would shape the country's modern history, the nationalists and the communists. In the southern city of Canton, Sun Yat-sen worked tirelessly to build the Kuomintang into a disciplined revolutionary organization. He sought support from the Western powers but found none willing to help. Instead, assistance came from the Soviet Union, whose envoys arrived with advice, resources, and a willingness to train a new generation of Chinese revolutionaries. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which China's struggle for renewal would intertwine with the ideological battles of the wider world. And so, from the long arc of humiliation and resistance, from the weight of foreign intrusion and the collapse of imperial authority, a new China began to take shape. It was not yet unified, it was not yet strong, but the seeds of transformation had been planted, and the forces that would reshape the nation were already gathering, waiting for their moment to rise. The end of the First World War brought a strange mixture of hope and disappointment to China. The world had spoken of self-determination, of nations rising from the ruins of empire, of a new era in which old injustices might finally be corrected. For many Chinese intellectuals, students, and reformers, this language stirred something long dormant, a belief that perhaps the humiliations of the past century might begin to lift. But when the Treaty of Versailles was finally revealed, the illusion dissolved almost instantly. Instead of restoring German-held territories in Shandong province to China, the treaty handed them to Japan, a nation that had already taken Korea and eyed the mainland with growing ambition. The news spread quickly, carried by newspapers, whispered in tea houses, and debated in university courtyards. It struck a nerve that had been exposed for decades, and the reaction was immediate. In Peking, students gathered in the spring sunlight, their anger sharpened by a sense of betrayal that felt both personal and national. They marched through the streets with banners and petitions, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed through the capital's ancient gates. Their protest was not merely against the treaty, it was against the long chain of humiliations that had preceded it, each link forged by foreign powers and accepted by a government too weak to resist. The movement did not remain confined to Peking. It spread outward like ripples on a still lake, reaching other cities, other schools, other communities that had grown weary of watching their country carved apart. In Shanghai, the unrest culminated in a massive general strike, a moment when workers, merchants, and students stood together in a rare display of unity. The strike brought the city to a halt, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the entire nation was breathing in unison, stirred by a shared sense of purpose. This wave of protest would come to be known as the May 4th movement, though its influence extended far beyond a single day. It marked a turning point in China's modern history, a moment when the younger generation rejected the old order and demanded something new. They called for science, democracy, national strength, and cultural renewal. But beneath all these ideals lay a deeper longing, the desire for a China that could stand on its own, unbowed and unbroken. Out of this atmosphere of intellectual ferment and political awakening emerged two powerful currents that would shape the country's future. On one side stood the nationalists, heirs to Sun Yat-sen's vision of a unified republic built on modern principles. They sought to strengthen the state, to end the warlord era, and to restore China's sovereignty in the face of foreign encroachment. On the other side rose the communists, inspired by Marxist theory and galvanized by the belief that true liberation could come only through a revolution led by workers and peasants. Their ideas found fertile ground among those who had grown disillusioned with the failures of the republic and the corruption of local elites. The two movements did not emerge fully formed, nor did they immediately recognize each other as rivals. At first, they were simply different responses to the same national crisis, different interpretations of how China might rise from the shadows of its past. But as the years unfolded, their paths diverged, shaped by ideology, ambition, and the pressures of a world in turmoil. The May 4th movement had awakened a generation, but it had also set the stage for a struggle that would define China's 20th century. For now, though, the story remained one of possibility. The protests had shown that the Chinese people could act with unity and conviction, that they could challenge injustice not only from abroad but from within. And as the echoes of the demonstrations faded into memory, the ideas they had unleashed continued to spread, carried by students returning to their hometowns, by workers discussing politics in factory dormitories, and by intellectuals writing essays that would circulate far beyond the cities where they were composed. In the quiet that followed the storm, China stood at a crossroads. Two great forces had begun to take shape, each claiming to offer a path toward national renewal. And though no one could yet see the conflicts that lay ahead, the contours of the future were already visible, drawn in the footsteps of the students who had marched through Peking on that bright spring day. In the years following the turmoil of the May 4th movement, China found itself searching for direction. The old imperial order had collapsed, yet the republic that replaced it lacked the strength to bind the country together. Warlords ruled their territories like miniature kingdoms, foreign powers still held concessions in the great coastal cities, and the dream of national renewal, though alive, seemed to drift like a lantern on a restless sea. It was in this unsettled landscape that new influences began to arrive from far beyond China's borders, carried not by merchants or missionaries, but by emissaries of a revolution that had reshaped Russia only a few years earlier. The Soviets came offering guidance, organization, and a promise of modernity. Their first envoy, Adolf Joffe, extended a hand to Sun Yat-sen when Western nations had turned away. Soon after, more advisors followed, men like Mikhail Grusenberg, known as Borodin, who brought with him the disciplined methods of the Bolshevik state, and General Vasily Blucher, who traveled under the name Galen and carried the knowledge of modern military training. They arrived in Canton with a sense of purpose, believing that China's struggle could be aligned with their own vision of global revolution, and they set to work reshaping the nationalist movement from within. Their influence was felt immediately. Government structures were reorganized, party discipline tightened, and in the humid air of southern China, a new military academy began to rise on an island near Canton, a place where young officers would be trained not only in tactics and strategy, but in the ideals of a modern, unified nation. This was the Whampoa Military Academy, and at its head stood a man whose name would soon become synonymous with China's nationalist cause. Chiang Kai-shek had chosen a military path out of a deep sense of patriotism. He believed that only through force and discipline Could China free itself from the warlords who divided it, and the foreign powers who exploited it? Beneath his crisp uniform and stern demeanor lay a fierce ambition, a determination that impressed some and unsettled others. When Sun Yat-sen sent him to Moscow for 4 months of study, Chiang absorbed what he saw with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He admired the efficiency of the Soviet system, yet he remained wary of its ideological demands. Still, the experience strengthened his resolve to build a modern army capable of reshaping China's future. Upon his return, Chiang took command of Whampoa with a seriousness that matched the gravity of the moment. He drilled his cadets relentlessly. He emphasized loyalty, discipline, and national purpose. And as the academy grew, so too did his influence within the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen, aging and ill, recognized the need for a strong military leader to carry forward the revolutionary cause. He placed his trust in Chiang, hoping that the younger man would one day complete the work he had begun. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. Sun died of cancer in the spring of 1925, leaving behind a movement still fragile and a country still fractured. But the structures he had built, strengthened by Soviet guidance and held together by the promise of national unity, were ready to move. In July of 1926, the Northern Expedition began, a sweeping military campaign designed to break the power of the warlords and bring China under a single government. Chiang Kai-shek led the offensive with a combination of strategic precision and political calculation. His forces advanced along the great river routes, capturing city after city. By early 1927, they reached Shanghai, where a workers' uprising organized by communist allies helped the nationalists seize control of the Chinese districts of the city. For a moment, it seemed as though the dream of unity was within reach. Chinese soldiers stood face to face with foreign troops guarding the international settlements, and the world watched as warships gathered in the harbor, ready to intervene if the conflict spilled across the invisible lines that divided the city. The Northern Expedition was a triumph, yet beneath its victories lay tensions that would soon erupt. The alliance between the nationalists and the communists, forged out of necessity and strengthened by Soviet influence, was beginning to strain. Chiang's supporters, merchants, bankers, and landowners feared the radicalism spreading through labor unions and peasant associations. They worried that the revolution they had supported might transform into something far more sweeping than they had intended. And Chiang himself, increasingly confident in his own authority, began to chafe at the presence of Soviet advisors and the growing influence of communist organizers. But for now, the story remained one of ascent. Chiang Kai-shek had risen from a determined young officer to the leader of a national army. The Soviets had played their part, offering tools and training that helped shape the early Kuomintang, and China, long divided and humiliated, seemed for a brief moment to be moving toward unity under a single banner. The path ahead, however, would not remain smooth. The alliances forged in Canton would soon fracture. The victories of the Northern Expedition would give way to new conflicts, and the man who had risen on the strength of foreign guidance would soon turn against those who had helped him ascend. Shanghai greeted the dawn of April 12, 1927 with a deceptive calm. The city's narrow lanes and wide boulevards were still wrapped in the soft grey of early morning, and the harbour lay quiet beneath a pale sky. But beneath that stillness, something volatile had been gathering for weeks, a tension that threaded through the factories, the foreign concessions, and the crowded neighborhoods where workers whispered about revolution and merchants whispered about fear. It was a city balanced on the edge of a blade, and as the first light touched the rooftops, the blade finally tipped. A single bugle call broke the silence. Its sharp notes cut through the air like a warning. though few understood what it meant. Moments later, a siren wailed from a Chinese gunboat anchored in the harbor, its echo rolling across the water and into the waking streets. These were the signals. They were the beginning of a purge that had been planned with precision, carried out with secrecy, and intended to reshape the future of China's revolution. As the city stirred, soldiers and undercover agents began to move through the shadows. Many belonged to the green and red circles, secret societies whose influence stretched deep into Shanghai's underworld. They slipped into alleys and courtyards, climbed staircases, and pushed open doors where communist organizers slept, unaware of the danger approaching. Some were shot before they could rise from their beds. Others were dragged into the streets, shackled together, and marched away in grim processions that disappeared into makeshift execution grounds. By nightfall, more than 300 people lay dead, and the alliance that had carried the northern expedition forward was shattered beyond repair. The massacre stunned the nationalist government. Many officials had not known it was coming, and their first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by outrage. Chiang Kai-shek, who had orchestrated the purge from his position in Shanghai, was formally expelled from both the party and the government. Yet he did not retreat into obscurity. Instead, he withdrew to Nanking and established a rival nationalist administration, confident that his vision for China would ultimately prevail. For a time, the country existed in a strange political limbo. Two nationalist governments claimed legitimacy. The communists, reeling from the violence, struggled to understand how their alliance had unraveled so suddenly, and the Soviets, who had invested so much in the United Front, watched with growing alarm as the movement they had helped shape began to fracture. The situation grew even more volatile. When new information surfaced, it became clear that the communists, acting under secret instructions from Stalin, had been preparing to seize control of the Kuomintang from within, using a workers' and peasants' army to overwhelm their nationalist partners. When this plot was uncovered, the remaining non-communist members of the nationalist government turned on their former allies with renewed ferocity. Executions resumed. Soviet advisors fled the country, and the fragile cooperation that had once seemed capable of unifying China dissolved into bitterness and bloodshed. By 1928, it appeared that communism in China had been dealt a mortal blow. Chiang's armies marched north, entering Peking and forcing the warlord coalition there to disband. His government gained recognition from major world powers, and for a moment it seemed as though he had succeeded in bringing the nation under a single banner. But beneath the surface, the fractures remained. The warlords still commanded vast armies, political rivals continued to challenge Chiang's authority, and the communists, though scattered and wounded, had not disappeared. They had simply gone underground, carrying with them a hardened resolve that would shape the next chapter of China's struggle. The Shanghai massacre marked the end of the United Front, but it also marked the beginning of something far more complex, a struggle between two visions of China, each convinced of its own righteousness, each willing to fight for the future it believed the nation deserved. And as the smoke cleared from the streets of Shanghai, the path ahead grew darker, more uncertain, and far more dangerous. By the late 1920s, the dust of the Northern Expedition had begun to settle, and a new political landscape emerged across China. Chiang Kai-shek stood at its center, a figure who had risen from the disciplined halls of Whampoa to command armies that stretched across provinces once ruled by feuding warlords. His forces had marched northward with determination, capturing cities that had long been symbols of fractured authority. When his troops entered Peking and the warlord coalition there dissolved, it seemed to many observers that a new era had finally arrived. China, after decades of turmoil, appeared to be moving toward unity under a single government. Foreign powers took notice. One by one, they extended recognition to Chiang's administration, acknowledging the nationalist government as the legitimate authority of China. Diplomatic cables crossed oceans, flags were raised, and in the great capitals of the world, officials spoke of stability, returning to a nation that had been synonymous with upheaval. For Chiang, these gestures carried immense symbolic weight. They suggested that China might once again stand among the world's sovereign nations, no longer defined solely by its concessions, its defeats, or its internal divisions. Yet beneath the surface, the reality was far more complicated. The warlords had not vanished. Their armies, though weakened, still numbered in the millions. They controlled vast territories, collected taxes, and maintained loyalties that ran deeper than any decree from Nanking. Their presence was like a series of dormant volcanoes scattered across the landscape, quiet for the moment, but capable of erupting without warning. And Chiang, despite his victories, understood this better than anyone. He knew that the unity he projected to the world was fragile, held together by alliances that could shift with the seasons, and by loyalties that might dissolve under pressure. The political challenges were no less daunting. Within the nationalist ranks, rivals questioned his leadership. Critics accused him of favoring certain factions, of relying too heavily on military authority, or of failing to address the deep social and economic problems that plagued the countryside. Newspapers carried whispers of discontent, party meetings grew tense, and though Chiang maintained a firm outward posture, he could not ignore the undercurrents that threatened to pull the movement apart from within. The burden of leadership weighed heavily on him. He had achieved what many before him had attempted and failed to accomplish, the semblance of a unified China, yet he sensed how easily it could slip away. The warlords remained entrenched. The communists, though battered by purges and forced into hiding, had not been extinguished, and the Japanese, already entrenched in Manchuria, watched China's internal struggles with calculating interest. Still, Chiang pressed forward. He strengthened his government's institutions. He sought to modernize the economy. He worked to extend nationalist authority into regions that had long resisted central control. But progress came slowly, often unevenly, and always against the backdrop of forces that resisted consolidation. The dream of unity remained just out of reach, shimmering like a distant horizon that receded with every step. And so, even as foreign diplomats praised his achievements and newspapers abroad spoke of a new China rising under his leadership, Chiang Kai-shek carried a private understanding that few others shared. He knew that the nation was not yet whole. He knew that the warlords' armies still cast long shadows across the provinces. And he knew that the struggle to unify China, truly unify it, had only just begun. In the aftermath of the Shanghai purges, the surviving communists scattered like embers carried by a shifting wind. Many were hunted down, many vanished into the countryside, but a few small bands managed to slip through the tightening net of nationalist patrols, moving deeper into the rugged interior of south-central China. It was there, in the remote mountains of Jiangxi province, that two of these battered groups finally converged in the spring of 19. Their numbers were small, barely 10,000 men in total, yet the determination that bound them together was stronger than any army they had faced. They chose the mountains not for comfort, but for survival. The terrain was harsh, the villages poor, and the roads little more than narrow paths carved into the hillsides. But the isolation offered protection, and the people who lived there had long endured hardship, making them more receptive to voices that spoke of change. In this rugged sanctuary, the communists began to rebuild. They reorganized themselves as the Fourth Red Army, placing military command in the hands of Chu Te, a seasoned soldier whose calm discipline steadied the men, and political leadership under Mao Zedong, whose ideas were beginning to diverge sharply from the doctrines favored in Moscow. Mao had spent years observing the rhythms of rural life. He had grown up among peasants taught in village schools and traveled through the countryside long enough to understand the quiet desperation that shaped daily existence. While many communist leaders insisted that revolution must begin in the cities, led by industrial workers, Mao saw something different. He believed that China's vast peasantry, poor, numerous, and long oppressed, held the true potential for transformation. Their grievances were deep, their anger simmered just below the surface, and in their sheer numbers, he saw a force capable of reshaping the nation. In Jiangxi, he set out to prove it. The Red Army depended entirely on the local population for food, shelter, and information, and Mao understood that loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be forged. He and Chu Te began a campaign that was both strategic and brutal. They targeted the figures who had long dominated rural life: landlords, tax collectors, petty officials, men who had extracted wealth from the peasants for generations. Public trials were staged, executions were carried out with theatrical severity. These acts were meant to terrify the old order and inspire the oppressed, and they did both. Villagers who had once feared speaking against authority now watched as the symbols of that authority were dragged into the open and punished. The violence was harsh, but it achieved its purpose. Gradually, the peasants began to trust the Red Army. They offered food, they provided shelter, they passed along information about nationalist troop movements, and as their support grew, the communists found themselves able to move through the countryside with a freedom they had never known in the cities. Mao described this relationship with a metaphor that would become famous. The Red Army, he said, must live among the people as a fish lives in water. It was a simple image, yet it captured the essence of his strategy. An army sustained not by supply lines or foreign aid, but by the loyalty of the very people it claimed to represent. As the months passed, the Jiangxi Soviet took shape. It was not a state in the traditional sense, but a patchwork of villages and mountain strongholds governed by communist committees. Land was redistributed, local militias were formed, schools and training centers appeared in places where none had existed before. The region remained poor, its resources limited, yet the sense of purpose that animated the movement gave it a vitality that belied its size. Still, life in the Jiangxi base was far from idyllic. The nationalists launched repeated campaigns to crush the growing communist presence, and each offensive brought new hardships. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, families were forced to flee deeper into the mountains. Yet the Red Army endured, hardened by the constant pressure and sustained by the belief that their struggle was part of something larger than themselves. For Mao, the Jiangxi years were transformative. They confirmed his conviction that China's revolution would not be born in the factories of Shanghai or the universities of Peking, but in the fields and villages where millions of peasants lived and worked. They also revealed the power of an army that could blend into the landscape, drawing strength from the people rather than imposing itself upon them. And though the Jiangxi Soviet would eventually be encircled and forced to flee, the ideas forged there would shape the future of the communist movement and, in time, the future of China itself. The night of September 18, 1931, settled over Manchuria with a deceptive quiet. The marshalling yards outside Mukden lay under a thin veil of darkness, their tracks gleaming faintly beneath the lanterns that dotted the rail lines. It was the kind of night when the world seemed suspended, when even the wind moved softly across the plains. And then, without warning, the stillness broke. A small charge of dynamite exploded near the South Manchurian Railroad, sending a brief flash of light into the sky and a tremor through the ground. The blast was minor, so minor that a train passed over the rails shortly afterward without difficulty. Yet its consequences would ripple across Asia and reshape the course of China's struggle. The explosion was no accident. It had been planted by Manchurian agents acting under Japanese direction, a carefully staged pretext designed to justify military action. Within hours, Japanese troops stationed in the region surged into motion. They seized towns, communication centers, and strategic points throughout southern Manchuria with a speed that suggested long preparation. The operation unfolded with such precision that it became clear the dynamite had been merely a spark for a fire already laid. Japan's motives were not hidden. The home islands were crowded, their farmland limited, their natural resources insufficient for an expanding empire. Manchuria, by contrast, was vast and rich, a land of coal, iron, and fertile plains, bordered by Siberia to the north and Korea to the south. Japan already controlled the southern portion of the territory, inherited from Russia after the Russo-Japanese War of 19. They owned the railroad, they owned the mines, they held towns along the line, but they wanted more. They wanted the entire region, both as a buffer against Russia and as a reservoir of wealth that could fuel their imperial ambitions. When news of the invasion reached Nanking, Chiang Kai-shek counseled restraint. China's armies were not yet strong enough to confront Japan directly, and its heavy industry lagged far behind. He announced that China would take its case to the League of Nations, hoping that international pressure might halt the Japanese advance. It was a strategy rooted in necessity, yet it depended on the willingness of other nations to act, a willingness that soon proved elusive. In Geneva, Japanese representatives insisted that their forces had intervened only to restore order, that they harbored no territorial ambitions, and that they would withdraw once safety had been secured. Their assurances were delivered with diplomatic calm, yet events on the ground told a different story. Japanese troops continued to push deeper into Manchuria, occupying city after city, while foreign delegates debated resolutions and exchanged formal notes. Across the ocean in Washington, Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson received reports from Nelson T. Johnson, the United States Minister to China. Johnson described the situation plainly. What was happening in Manchuria, he wrote, must fall within any definition of war, a clear violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, in which major powers had renounced the use of force. Stimson urged action, but his appeals met little enthusiasm. Britain responded coolly. France did not respond at all. Japan's reply bordered on open defiance. Eventually, the League of Nations appointed a commission led by Britain's Lord Lytton to investigate the crisis. But while the commission travelled, interviewed, and deliberated, Japan continued to consolidate its hold. By February 1932, the transformation was complete. Manchuria was proclaimed an independent state under Japanese protection and given a new name, Manchukuo, the land of the Manchu. At its head, the Japanese installed Henry Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, who had once sat on the dragon throne as a child and now found himself a puppet in a foreign-controlled regime. When the Lytton Commission finally issued its report, it condemned Japan's actions unequivocally. The League accepted the findings. Japan responded by walking out of the assembly, withdrawing from the League entirely, and pressing its invasion farther into the Chinese provinces of Jeolla and Chaha. The message was unmistakable. Japan would not be constrained by international opinion, and it would not relinquish what it had taken. For China, the loss of Manchuria was a profound shock. It revealed the limits of diplomacy, the fragility of international agreements, and the stark imbalance between China's aspirations and its military capabilities. It also deepened the sense of urgency within the nationalist government, for Chiang Kai-shek understood that only a unified China could hope to resist such aggression. Yet unity remained elusive. The warlords still commanded their armies, the communists still held their mountain bases, and the Japanese, emboldened by their success, were already looking southward. The seizure of Manchuria marked the beginning of a new and darker chapter. It was a warning, a demonstration of imperial ambition, and a prelude to a conflict that would soon engulf the entire nation. And as the world watched, uncertain and divided, China braced itself for the storms that lay ahead. By the early 1930s, the nationalist government faced a dilemma that seemed to deepen with every passing season. Japan's grip on Manchuria tightened in the north, yet Chiang Kai-shek remained convinced that China could not confront an external enemy while internal divisions still festered. He believed that only a unified nation, disciplined, centralized, and obedient to a single authority, could hope to resist foreign aggression. And so, even as the Japanese advanced, he turned his attention once more to the communists who had carved out their own territory in the mountains of Kiangsi. The campaigns that followed were described officially as anti-bandit operations, a term meant to diminish the political significance of the communist movement. But the scale of the effort revealed the seriousness with which Qing viewed the threat. Nationalist forces moved steadily into the region, constructing fortified lines that stretched across the hills like a tightening net. Pillboxes rose along the ridges, machine gun nests appeared at strategic passes, roads were cut, supply routes were severed, and slowly, methodically, the nationalists began to squeeze the life out of the communist-held areas. At the heart of the resistance lay the city of Juqin, a modest settlement that had become the administrative center of the Kiangsi Soviet. It was here that Mao Zedong, Chu Te, and their fellow leaders directed their operations, issuing orders, training recruits, and attempting to maintain morale in the face of mounting pressure. But as the nationalist lines drew closer, the city grew increasingly isolated, food became scarce, medical supplies dwindled, and the once fluid movements of the Red Army were constrained by the ever-tightening ring of fortifications. The blockade was relentless. Nationalist troops patrolled the perimeter day and night, intercepting messengers, capturing supply caravans, and cutting off any attempt to break through. Villages that had supported the communists found themselves trapped between two forces, their fields trampled, their homes burned, their loyalties tested by hunger and fear. The cost of the campaign was staggering. One estimate placed the number of soldiers and civilians who died in Kiangsi, whether by violence, starvation, or disease, at nearly 1 million. It was a toll that weighed heavily on the land, leaving behind scars that would endure long after the armies had moved on. Inside Juqin, the atmosphere grew increasingly desperate. Leaders debated strategy late into the night, their discussions illuminated by flickering lamps and punctuated by the distant rumble of artillery. Some argued for holding the city at all costs. Others urged a breakout before the noose tightened further. The Red Army, though resilient, was exhausted. Its ranks were thinned by years of fighting. Its weapons were worn, and its commanders knew that remaining in Kiangsi meant facing a slow, suffocating defeat. By mid-1934, the situation had become untenable. The nationalist encirclement was nearly complete, and the blockade had reduced the communist stronghold to the brink of collapse. The leadership faced a choice that was as painful as it was unavoidable: stay and perish, or abandon the base they had built and attempt a daring escape through the nationalist lines. The decision weighed heavily on every man and woman in the Soviet, for they understood that leaving Kiangsi meant embarking on a journey into the unknown, a journey that would test their endurance, their unity, and their belief in the cause they had sworn to uphold. The choice was made. In October 1934, under cover of darkness, roughly 100,000 men and 35 women gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the only refuge they had known for years. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the earth, their breath visible in the cool night air. Ahead of them lay a path filled with danger, hardship, and uncertainty. Behind them lay a city encircled by enemies, its fate sealed by the tightening ring of nationalist fortifications. The encirclement of Kiangsi had achieved its purpose. It had forced the communists from their stronghold, but it had also set in motion a journey that would become one of the most extraordinary episodes in modern Chinese history. A journey that would carry the Red Army across mountains, rivers, and deserts, and that would ultimately reshape the balance of power in the nation. For now, though, the story remained one of siege and suffocation, of a movement pressed to the brink by a campaign designed to extinguish it. And as the last columns slipped away from Juichin, the nationalist lines closed behind them, sealing off the city that had once been the heart of the communist revolution. The night the communists left Kiangsi was moonless and still, the kind of night when sound carries far, and every footstep feels heavier than it should. The air was cool, touched by the faint scent of autumn leaves, and the hills surrounding Juichin lay in a hush that seemed almost reverent. Into that darkness moved a long, silent column of men and women, some 100,000 soldiers and 35 women, each carrying what little they could manage, each knowing they were stepping into a journey from which many would never return. They walked without torches. They spoke only in whispers, and though the path ahead was uncertain, the alternative behind them was certain death. The nationalist encirclement had tightened like a steel ring around Kiangsi, leaving no room for survival, no hope of reinforcement, no possibility of holding the city that had served as the heart of their movement. The decision to leave had been agonizing, but once made, it carried its own momentum, pushing the Red Army forward into the night. The first hours of the march were tense. Nationalist patrols roamed the countryside, and the communists had to slip between fortified lines that bristled with machine gun nests and watchtowers. Scouts moved ahead, feeling their way through the darkness, searching for gaps in the blockade. Behind them, the main body advanced slowly, their footsteps muffled by the earth, their breath rising in faint clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. Every sound, a snapped twig, a distant shout, the rustle of a pack, felt like a warning. Yet somehow, through a mixture of planning, luck, and sheer determination, the Red Army broke through. They emerged from the ring of fortifications battered but intact, leaving behind the city that had sheltered them for years. Ahead lay a vast and unforgiving landscape, mountains, rivers, swamps, and plains, and behind them lay the nationalist forces, already mobilizing to pursue the fleeing column. The early days of the march were marked by exhaustion. The soldiers carried heavy packs, weapons, and supplies, yet they moved with a steady rhythm born of necessity. They crossed narrow mountain paths where a single misstep could send a man tumbling into ravines. They waded through marshes where the mud clung to their legs like a living thing. They passed through villages where the people watched in silence, unsure whether to offer help or hide behind shuttered doors. Chiang Kai-shek's forces were never far behind. The Generalissimo, driven by a fierce determination to crush the communist movement once and for all, ordered his troops to shadow the march, harassing the rear guard, cutting off supply routes, and attempting to force the Red Army into terrain where escape would be impossible. At times his private planes circled overhead, allowing him to watch the long line of marchers from above, a distant, relentless presence that reminded the communists that they were being hunted. The Red Army moved south and west, choosing routes that confounded nationalist expectations. Instead of heading north, as Chiang had predicted, they veered into unfamiliar territory, threading their way through some of the most rugged landscapes in China. The terrain was harsh, but it offered a kind of protection, for the nationalist armies struggled to follow in such difficult country. Still, the danger never fully receded. Every valley held the possibility of an ambush. Every river crossing threatened disaster. Every night brought the fear that the nationalists might catch up. Yet amid the hardship, a strange sense of purpose began to take hold. The marchers were exhausted, hungry, and often soaked by rain or chilled by mountain winds. But they were also bound together by a shared conviction that their struggle meant something, that survival itself was an act of defiance. They sang quietly as they walked. They shared what little food they had. They carried the wounded when they could, and when they could not, they said their farewells and moved on, knowing that the march could not stop for grief. The long march had begun, not as a grand strategy, but as a desperate escape. Yet even in its earliest days, it carried the seeds of something larger, a journey that would test the limits of endurance, reshape the communist movement, and carve itself into the memory of a nation. For now, though, it remained a long line of weary travelers moving through the darkness, guided by hope, necessity, and the faint promise of a distant refuge somewhere beyond the mountains. The long march had already carried the Red Army across valleys and ridges that seemed to stretch without end. Yet the most punishing trials still lay ahead. As the column wound deeper into the interior, the land grew harsher, the mountains steeper, and the air thinner. Days blurred into one another, marked by aching feet, dwindling supplies, and the constant awareness that nationalist forces shadowed them like a distant storm. The marchers pressed on because stopping meant annihilation, and moving forward, even blindly, offered at least the faint outline of hope. The terrain shifted constantly. One morning they climbed through forests where the trees stood so close together that the light barely reached the ground, and the next they descended into valleys where the wind swept across the plains with a lonely, unbroken howl. Rain turned the paths into rivers of mud. Frost hardened the earth at night, and always somewhere behind them, Chiang Kai-shek's armies advanced, determined to crush the fleeing communists before they could regroup. It was in Sichuan province that the marchers encountered a barrier that seemed designed to break them. The Tartu River cut through the mountains in a deep, violent gorge, its waters churning with a force that echoed off the cliffs. The only way across was an ancient bridge built in 1701, suspended by 13 massive iron chains that stretched from one side of the canyon to the other. The wooden planks that once formed the bridge's floor had been removed by nationalist troops, who now held fortified positions on the far bank. They believed the chains alone would be enough to stop the Red Army, for no one could cross them under fire, or so they thought. The communists reached the river exhausted, hungry, and pursued. The gorge roared beneath them, a reminder of how easily a misstep could erase a life. The nationalists waited on the opposite cliff, confident that the Red Army had finally been cornered. They could have severed the chains and ended the march then and there, but superstition and pride held them back. The bridge was a relic of regional wealth, a symbol of local identity, and they hesitated to destroy it. That hesitation would prove decisive. The Red Army gathered at the river's edge, studying the impossible span. The chains swayed slightly in the wind, glinting in the pale light. The cliffs rose like walls on either side. And then, in a moment that would become legend, 30 communist volunteers stepped forward. They were young, hardened by months of marching, and fully aware that the task before them was likely a death sentence, yet they moved with a quiet resolve, as though the decision had already been made long before they reached the river. Armed with pistols and grenades, the volunteers climbed onto the chains. They advanced hand over hand, their bodies suspended hundreds of feet above the raging water. Bullets tore through the air. Splinters of rock flew from the cliffside. The chains shook under the weight of the men, but still they moved forward, inch by inch, driven by a determination that defied the danger beneath them. Their comrades on the near bank laid down, covering fire, filling the gorge with the echo of gunshots that mingled with the roar of the river. One by one, the volunteers reached the far side. They hurled grenades into the nationalist machine gun nests, clearing a foothold on the cliff. Smoke rose from the explosions. Shouts echoed across the gorge, and in that narrow window of chaos, the rest of the Red Army surged into action. Planks were dragged forward and laid across the chains. Soldiers crawled, ran, and scrambled across the makeshift bridge as the battle raged around them. The nationalist defenses faltered. The communists seized the far bank, and the impossible crossing became reality. With the Tattoo River behind them, the marchers pressed onward into even more unforgiving terrain. They climbed freezing mountain passes where the wind cut like a blade. They slogged through swamps that swallowed boots and slowed every step. They crossed arid plains where the sun beat down without mercy. Bands of hostile tribesmen harassed them from the hills. Disease and hunger stalked the column, and yet, despite everything, the Red Army continued to move, driven by the belief that survival itself was a form of victory. By the time they reached the northern mountains of Shensi province in late October 1935, the marchers had traveled more than 6,000 miles, twice the width of the North American continent, in just over a year. They had crossed 18 mountain ranges and 24 rivers. They had endured ambushes, starvation, exhaustion, and loss on a scale that defied comprehension. Of the roughly 100,000 who had set out from Kiangsi, fewer than 20,000 remained. Some historians would later estimate the number of survivors at only 5,000. Those who reached Pauan were gaunt, ragged, and forever changed. But they were alive, and in their survival, the communist movement found a new beginning, forged not in comfort or certainty, but in the crucible of a march that had tested every limit of human endurance. The marchers reached the highlands of northern Shensi, as though emerging from the far end of a long, dim corridor, one carved by exhaustion, hunger, and the unbroken rhythm of footsteps that had carried them across mountains, rivers, and the vast interior of China. Their arrival at Pauan came not with triumphal banners or the roar of welcoming crowds, but with the quiet relief of survivors who had outlasted the impossible. The land around them was stark and wind-scoured, a place where the earth seemed to remember centuries of hardship, yet it offered something the marchers had not known for more than a year: stillness. They settled into this remote refuge with the tentative care of people relearning how to breathe. The hills were bare, the soil thin, the villages small and poor, but the very isolation of Shensi gave the communists what they needed most: a chance to rebuild. Their numbers had been reduced to a fraction of what they once were, yet the survivors carried with them a hardened resolve, a sense that endurance itself had become a kind of weapon. And in this quiet corner of the Northwest, they began once more to shape the outlines of a political and military base, hoping that other scattered remnants of the movement might eventually find their way to them. Time in Shensi moved differently. Days unfolded slowly, marked by the sound of wind brushing across the Loess hills and the distant calls of farmers tending thin fields. Nights were colder, deeper, and strangely comforting to those who had spent months sleeping under fire. The communists used these long hours to reorganize their ranks, to re-establish lines of authority, and to consider what the future might demand of them. The long march had not only scattered their enemies, it had also clarified their purpose. They had survived, and survival had given them a new kind of legitimacy. Yet the world beyond Shensi was shifting in ways that none of them could ignore. Each new Japanese advance in the north sent tremors through the political landscape, stirring anger and fear in equal measure. Reports filtered into the mountains, towns seized, borders pushed, the steady tightening of an imperial grip. With every step Japan took deeper into Chinese territory, the sense of national humiliation grew sharper, and the call for unity grew louder. Far away in Moscow, Stalin watched these developments with a wary eye. Germany was rearming in the west, Japan pressing in from the east, and the Soviet Union found itself caught between two rising threats. In 1935, the Comintern issued a new directive. All forces opposed to fascism, whether in Europe or Asia, must set aside their quarrels and form a united front. It was a shift in doctrine that rippled outward, reaching even the remote valleys of Shensi, where the communists began to reconsider their long and bitter struggle against the nationalists. The new line from Moscow did not erase old grievances, but it reframed them. If fascism was the greater danger, then China's internal war had become a luxury the nation could no longer afford, and as word of the directive spread, it found fertile ground among students and intellectuals in the cities. Demonstrations erupted once more, echoes of earlier movements calling for national salvation, for unity, for resistance against the foreign power that was swallowing Chinese territory piece by piece. These protests carried a restless energy. Young people marched through Shanghai and other cities, their voices rising above the noise of rickshaws and street vendors, demanding that China stand together against Japan. Their banners fluttered like small flames in the wind, and their chants echoed through alleyways and marketplaces. But Chiang Kai-shek, still committed to crushing the communists, saw these demonstrations not as patriotic fervor, but as subversion. He ordered the arrest of the movement's leaders, believing that unity could come only after internal enemies were eliminated. In Shensi, however, another man was beginning to question that logic. Marshal Chang Shuiliang, the young Manchurian commander, whose forces had retreated westward after Japan seized his homeland, found himself increasingly troubled by the orders coming from Nanking. He had seen firsthand what Japanese expansion looked like. He had watched Manchuria fall, and now, as Chang demanded that he turn his troops against the communists in Shensi, Chang felt the weight of a deeper loyalty, one not to party or faction, but to the nation itself. The tension between duty and conscience grew heavier with each passing week. Chang had already opened secret channels to the communists, seeking some path toward cooperation. He knew the risks, he knew the consequences, but he also knew that continuing the civil war while Japan advanced was a betrayal of everything he believed China should be. And so, in the quiet valleys of Shensi, the seeds of a new alignment began to take root. The communists, battered but alive, were rebuilding. The students in the cities were calling for unity. Stalin's directive pressed for cooperation, and Marshal Chang, torn between obedience and patriotism, was edging toward a decision that would soon reshape the course of modern Chinese history. The air in Shensi grew colder as winter approached, but beneath the frost and the silence, something was shifting slowly, invisibly, like the first stirrings of a long-awaited thaw. The summer air around the old stone arches of the Marco Polo Bridge carried a warmth that clung to the skin, the kind of gentle heat that makes the world feel deceptively calm. Evening light drifted across the river in soft ribbons, and for a moment the countryside outside Wanping seemed suspended in a quiet older than any empire. Yet beneath that stillness, tension coiled like a drawn bowstring, invisible but waiting, as if the land itself sensed that something irreversible was about to begin. A single Japanese company was out on maneuvers that night, conducting what was officially described as a routine training exercise. Lanterns flickered against the walls of the walled town, and the rhythmic sound of boots on packed earth echoed faintly across the fields. It should have been an uneventful drill, the kind of movement soldiers perform without thinking, but one missing man, one absence in the dark, became the spark that set history ablaze. The Japanese demanded entry into Wanping to search for him, and the Chinese garrison refused, insisting on their right to protect their own ground. A short sentence spoken at a gate, a simple refusal, and the world shifted. Gunfire cracked through the night air. It began as a brief exchange, sharp and startling, like a sudden summer storm, yet the echoes lingered, and the smoke did not clear, and what might have been a small border incident began to swell into something far larger, as if the conflict had been waiting just beneath the surface, hungry for release. The firefight grew, then spread, then refused to die down, and within hours the fragile balance between the two nations had collapsed. In the days that followed, the Japanese High Command in North China launched what they called a punitive expedition, a phrase that sounded clinical on paper, but unfolded with devastating force on the ground. Waves of aircraft bearing the Red Sun insignia rose into the sky and swept southward, their engines droning like an approaching storm front. They strafed roads, villages, columns of retreating soldiers, anything that moved. The earth shook beneath the weight of advancing infantry and the grinding treads of tanks, each machine pushing deeper into Chinese territory with a confidence born of superior firepower and long-prepared plans. Peking and Tientsin fell, railheads, passes, and ancient fortifications that had stood for centuries were overrun in a matter of days. The Great Wall itself, symbol of endurance, of resistance, of the long memory of a civilization, was breached as Japanese forces fanned out across the plains, driving relentlessly toward the Yellow River. Chinese armies, vast in number but fractured in command and starved of modern equipment, were forced to yield ground again and again. They fought, regrouped, fought again, but the momentum of the Japanese offensive was overwhelming, a tide that refused to ebb. In desperation and necessity, China signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, securing promises of aircraft, ammunition, and other aid through secret clauses whispered behind closed doors. Yet even as the north burned, the conflict widened. Far to the south, in Shanghai, a city of neon lights, foreign concessions, and restless crowds, another spark ignited. 2 Japanese Marines were killed in the streets, and the incident became the pretext for a new assault. The Japanese fleet anchored in the harbor responded with brutal efficiency, sending landing forces ashore while naval guns thundered across the waterfront. Shells burst over the city in blossoms of fire, and planes from Formosa swooped in to drop their payloads, turning familiar streets into landscapes of smoke and ruin. Tens of thousands of troops poured into the struggle from both sides. The International District, normally a place of uneasy coexistence, became a battleground of confusion and terror. Bombs meant for military targets fell wildly off course. One Chinese bomb, intended for the battleship Izumo, tore into the Palace Hotel instead, killing civilians who had no part in the conflict. Another struck the Great World Amusement Park in the French concession, a place where families had sought refuge, killing hundreds and wounding hundreds more. Even the USS Augusta, anchored peacefully in the harbor, was struck by a stray anti-aircraft shell, an accidental reminder that war, once unleashed, respects no boundaries. The smoke rising from Shanghai mingled with the dust of the north, and together they signaled a truth that could no longer be denied. The conflict that began at the Marco Polo Bridge was no longer a skirmish, no longer a misunderstanding, no longer containable. It had become a full-scale war, one that would reshape Asia, redraw alliances, and pull millions into its orbit. And as the flames spread, the world watched, some with alarm, some with indifference, and some with the quiet recognition that a new chapter of global conflict had begun, written in the gunfire that first echoed across a quiet bridge on a warm July night.